Hello, and welcome to Life Beyond the Numbers, the podcast for people who are curious about how to have a more fulfilling work life. We live in a world largely driven by numbers, logic, and reason. But how we feel at work and about our work impacts us, our organisations, and society. There is a relationship between the numbers of our organisations and the life beyond the numbers. I'm Susan Nichrialon, your host. I've lived and worked in many countries. I've met people who love what they do and people who don't, people who bring their full selves to work and people who won't. But one thing that I've learned that is common to us all is that we are all unique and have unique experiences. And it's helpful to know that there are others who think like we do, or have had struggles too, or have gone where we want to go, or can show us things we didn't know. So join me and my guests as we place a lens on the human side of work life by sharing insights, stories, and strategies to inspire you to let your uniqueness shine through. Well, today I am delighted to be joined by Phil Brown on Life Beyond the Numbers. Phil, you're very welcome.
Susan, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually looking forward to this a great deal.
That's good to hear. And it sounds like you're surprised by that as well.
Well, you know what? We connected up, but the whole idea of what you're trying to do in the audience and to give real life stories and just make things a bit more human, I think, is really great. And I am really interested to see where this is going to go.
Excellent. That's a great start anyway. So let's get right into it, because we were almost getting right into it before we pressed record. And I was like, okay, let's stop. And actually, because one of the things that I had said to you, and that's what got us right into it, was I think negotiation is something that we have to do so much day to day. And I often think that we underestimate how much we are negotiating. You may think differently.
I do push back on it slightly, okay? And the reason why I push back on it is that the negotiation is a human interaction. We're social animals, okay? And one of the values and one of the strengths that we have as that kind of species is that we problem solve. And the way that I describe negotiation is negotiation is a problem solving activity. But the danger there is then, well, in that case, you can capture everything as a negotiation. And I think that then does a disservice to the skills that you need when you are specifically negotiating. So I'd probably push back on it and say, look, we do negotiate, but when it comes to purposeful negotiations, it's a slightly different level. And I think that's where we should focus as individuals and say, look, we go through life fine, but when we have a purposeful negotiation, I mean, buying a car, selling a sofa, going for a job interview, those are negotiations that you can really prepare for. But having a discussion really about where you're going to eat at a restaurant, yeah, it's not really the same type of negotiations, I'd argue. So that's my only pushback. That's where I go.
And that's fair enough. And however, I guess I'm thinking, if you're always a pushover and never getting to go to the restaurant you want to go to, that, that actually having some of those skills are helpful too.
Yeah, and listen, those skills really, they develop other aspects of your personality, the confidence. So if you're not going to the restaurant, that's not necessarily because you haven't got the negotiation skills, but haven't you got the confidence? And the one thing I would say, Susan, is over the last few years, one of the major byproducts of what I've been doing, which is practicing negotiation skills with people, is people turning around and saying, I feel more confident. And not just in negotiations, but they feel more confident as an individual. And I think that's the bit that I often miss in explaining to people. It's not negotiation skills. This is about you building your confidence, your character, your capabilities.
Absolutely. So, Phil, what are the skills that you would capture under negotiation skills?
I've already mentioned one, which is problem solving. I want to step back a little bit because if you listen to a lot of people who talk about negotiations, the one thing they always talk about is preparation and planning. All right. And This is where I slightly go against the grain as well. Because for me, that is just one part of it. The very first slide I have when I'm teaching people how to practice negotiations is there's two parts to negotiation. There's that job knowledge, that experience, the research, the planning you bring in, but then there are the personal skills. And the personal skills is what I focus on. It's not the job knowledge. And when I talk about that, I'm talking about things like active listening, questioning, observation. And out of those three, the one that I always emphasize as being the most important is observation. And the reason why I state that is because if you are in a negotiation, you know what you want, you don't know what the other party wants. And therefore, it is only through the observing of the responses, both the verbal, the non-verbal responses you get, that you're able to gauge where you're at in a negotiation. So for me, when it comes down to the skills, I think there's some specific skills. One of and the main one is being observation. And observation is not something you can read about. You just can't. So nobody talks about it. But everybody talks about planning because in a way it's easy to plan. But I always say you can plan, which gets you to the starting line. But if you haven't done the training, got the skills or practice, you're not going to finish across the end line. I mean, Susan, you can prepare to go in. You could say, right, I'm going to go in and I'm buying a car. And you say, right, I'm going to go down to the sales court, the forecourt, or whatever, and I want to put an offer in. I'm going to put an offer in of £5,000 or whatever it is. Okay, so you can plan that, you can think about it, you can write it down. But the moment you get on that court and you've then got to face a person and say to them, yeah, listen, it's a bit high. You can't even bring yourself to say, listen, I'll pay you 5,000 for that because the skills have not been addressed. For me, that's where I sort of push back on people who talk about the preparation and planning. Yep, it is important, but there's no point in planning if you can't execute it. And it's the execution which is where people fail.
And I guess it's like anything, isn't it, Phil, in a way? I mean, you're not going to learn how to drive by reading about it in a book. You're going to learn how to drive by actually getting in behind the wheel of a car and driving. And the other thing, I suppose, is I find this in the work that I do as well, is that we often think because we are humans, that we can interact well with other humans. However, there are a lot of skills that we need to learn to do that better, which again is back to practice.
Yeah, and again, we can even pick that to another level, which is when we go in and we're having a negotiation or an interaction or a conversation with people, what we often do is we project our values, our expectations, our languages upon the other person as if that's the way that they're going to behave. The only person in a negotiation that you can trust is yourself because you know what's in your own mind. You cannot really do that with the other party. So again, come back to the observation, but what you hear and what you listen to, you have to then sort of gauge as to whether that is, does it come across as right or wrong? And every single person is different. Life beyond the numbers. There are some individuals out there who are absolutely on the ball when it comes to numbers and logic problems and everything else, but they're not very sociable. And there are some people who can literally within seconds work out a person and know what type of person they are, but they wouldn't be able to remember how they got there or what the sums were or what the inflation rate is at the moment because we're all different. And interesting enough, I often talk in negotiations when I work with clients about team negotiations. And in team negotiations, what you're looking for is you're looking for those strengths. It's like playing football. When you're a kid, when you're a child, everyone wants to be the striker. Nobody wants to be in goal. But if you want to win, you need a goalie, midfield, defense, and a striker, and together you win. And that's why I talk about negotiations. There are people with different strengths. And if you're in a business, if you can identify those strengths, oof, you're in a really good place. But if you recruit everybody who's exactly the same, oof, that's like having a team full of strikers.
And it's the same for anything, isn't it, when it comes to work, whether it's negotiation or whatever. You want to have the best people and you want to have a rounded set of people skills. You don't want to have, like you say, everyone doing exactly the same thing. But what about negotiating a salary? So I think this is something that people often underestimate, neglect, and really don't have the skills to do.
Yes, but I'd come back to that previous bit, which is about confidence. And a lot of the confidence comes from practicing things as well. And that underpins a lot of it. And what often happens, it's like people doing a cold call, in sales. When you do the first lot of them and you're getting kicked back and kicked down, you think, oh, this is no good, I'm not going to do it again. But in many ways, you're persevering, you're learning, and you're getting better. I mean, when it comes to job salaries or even job interviews, and I do a lot of work with students, and I often say to them, listen, apply for the jobs you don't want. Use those as opportunities to practice your interview skills. Because then when the job that comes up that you really do want, you're not going to go in there cold without really understanding the kind of the nuances of the interaction. You would have practiced beforehand. And I would also advise that for people who are in jobs, even if you're in a job and you're happy in the job, don't be afraid to go out and go for job interviews because, again, it just keeps your mind at a level which is much easier to do that. Job salaries is an interesting one, okay? Because it's not always about the money. There's a whole load of value and variables that you can actually think about and discuss. Working from home, for example. If you work from home for 1 day a week or 2 days a week, once you start thinking about how much money you're saving in transportation costs, petrol, fuel tickets, even on your clothing, if you wear a suit to work and you're wearing it 5 days a week and suddenly you're only wearing it 3 days a week, you've just actually improved the life of your suit by about 40% or something like that. So suddenly it's worth money. So I actually called it my beer test at university. And I used to grade everything that I purchased, including the books, on how many pints of beer this was going to cost me in the evening. So if I could save myself some beer in buying something, then I was made. And I think that's what you can do as an individual is relate what you're doing to something which is of value to you and put everything in there. Whether it's working from home, it's uniforms, whether it's an extra day's holiday, whether it's an upgraded phone, whether it's even a title rather than being just a buyer, being a senior buyer or agreeing to have certain training. These add value to it, which is above and beyond the value of a salary. And in fact, what you'll also find is that a salary is something much harder to tweak and change. Partly because, as the other person on the other side, they'd like to have a higher salary, I'm sure. Okay. So they don't want to give it to other people, but they can give other things away that's not going to cost them. So you can definitely do that. I've got a story for you. In fact, I've got a story for you here. And this is going back a number of years ago. Now, there's a tactic in negotiations called the odd number. And I do love the odd number. I tell it to a lot of people. Okay. And the idea is that if you go in with a nice round number, it's easily recognized, but it's easily counted. Probably about 8 years ago, I got a friend of mine, and they're HGV driver, self-employed, and works through an agency. So they get an hourly rate. Okay. Now I can't exactly remember the exact rate, but I know that he basically got himself up an additional amount. He was getting paid an extra pound an hour more than everybody else. So he was like £14 an hour, and everybody else was on £13 an hour, for example. Yeah. And this is because he'd asked for it, he'd got it originally, and obviously he was very, very good at what he did. He never had any complaints. Anyway, the management then turned around and said, right, okay, we're putting everybody up by another pound, except for you. So everybody's going to be on the same rate. Now, as it happened, a friend of his was also on an extra pound. So say everybody's on 13, but those two on 14, and everybody else had gone up to 14. So his mate said, oh, I'm not having this. I've got to go in. So he went and had a conversation with the management, and the management said, no, I'm not doing anything. He said, so he comes back and he speaks to my friend. He says, oh, I tried to get it. I couldn't get it. Just they won't give us this extra pound. Now I've been speaking to my friend, and he went in and he said, listen, the reasons why you pay us an extra pound is because we do a great service and everything else. So, it should be £15 an hour now for us. I know that. No. And they said, listen, you've got to put something on the table. So anyway, he persisted, which is the first thing. All right. Intransigence. Don't back down straight away. Keep going. You're going to get rejected, almost certainly. So they said, well, we'll do 14 and a half. And my friend, he said, that won't do. That won't do. He said, but if you agree to 78 pence. And then I'll take that. And the manager on the other side was like, 78 pence? Oh, okay. I'll go and have a chat. Anyway, he then came back later on and said, yeah, you get your 78 pence. And the point of the story is there's a few things going on, which everybody can do. First of all, is don't take the first rejection as the rejection. Push back. Make sure you've got your ducks in a row. There's a reason why, so you can justify that. And then on the first offer, again, nice round numbers. If it's a nice round number coming back, that's just because it's easy for them. Split the difference. Seems fair. Fair is another word in negotiations. Come back with an odd number. And 9 out of 10 times, the odd number will get through because it just feels and sounds like there's a reason behind it. So again, salaries and everything else, don't think about it's got to be a round number. Come up with an odd number because it gets the other person thinking. And the moment they're thinking about it means the longer it stays in their head, it gets harder to get away from.
This is brilliant, Phil, because it's exactly what I was thinking about before we started our call, because I have experience of that myself and it works. Because I did negotiation training quite a number of years ago and it was absolutely brilliant. It was experiential and we'll come on to yours in a second. But one of the things I learned was asking for an odd number. And in a salary negotiation, I did that. So there was a big gap between what I was expecting and what they were expecting. And I came back and countered with a very odd number altogether. So odd that they were like, oh, well, you've obviously done your homework and your research and there's a reason for this. And it went through. Yeah. And I also gave a colleague the same recommendation and it worked for them. Those even numbers are too easy the round numbers are too easy to counter and split the difference and all of that. And I think it's a really good, you just don't want everyone to know it, but it's a really good tactic.
Well, there's another one maybe with salary negotiations as well, in that often the salary negotiation is taken on the full total thing. All right. Say for argument's sake, I don't know, 36,000 a year. All right. Well, that's £2,000 a month. My sums is wrong there. £3,000 a month. Yeah. All right. So, but 36 is a huge number. All right. It is a big number. Okay. £3,000 is a much smaller number. All right. And what you can also do is actually change the conversation from the total salary to talking about the monthly salary. So instead of saying, right, on £3,000 a month, or £36,000 a year, yeah, you said, look, I can understand and appreciate the £3,000 a month, but for me to be able to work effectively, I need £3,280 a month. All right, so 3,200. Now, £280 doesn't sound like much either, but £280 is almost another 10%. And if they agree to 3,280, you've actually just got almost a 10% increase. Bit of an odd number, smaller number, feels more manageable, doesn't feel as if they're giving too much away. But if you ask for 38,000 or 39,000, it adds it all up. So again, it's about the framing, how you frame it. And the smaller numbers might feel more acceptable, more manageable, but in the bigger scale, it's actually a big movement.
Yeah. And I also liked what you talked about, the adding value other ways, looking at other things, because I think that is really important as well, because in anything, there's always features or benefits that can be negotiated on. But Phil, negotiation, it sounds like it's kind of almost in your blood.
Yeah. I know where you're leading with this one. Okay, so I've got a little story for you here. Okay, so lots of people in families, they follow on from what their parents did beforehand. So interestingly enough, back in the late 70s and early 80s, my father, who was a procurement professional, started to give courses on negotiations and procurement skills in night school. He started to do this. And then he started his own business. He started up his own training firm, and it was purchasing management services. So it was all things to do with procurement, one of which being negotiations. And this is back in the early 80s, and there was nothing else around. So he was busy. I mean, he was busy. He was having like 40 people in a course in a lecture room, and this is week in, week out. So I had to go in and start helping him. And the way it worked is that he would give the delegates a task to negotiate, and then they would go into a side room And there I was as a pimply 10-year-old boy with this huge suitcase of a video camera with a cassette in it. And I would have to record them negotiating. And then when they finished, I'd give them their cassette and they'd go back into the other room. And I was like, well, I actually really enjoyed this because I could see them negotiating. And I learned a lot from that. And eventually, not long later, I mean, again, still 10 or 11 years old, I actually sat down and did the negotiation with my father. So we did a little negotiation course. And I always remember we videoed it. So I'm sat there opposite my father and he's giving me the notes and he's got the notes. So we're doing negotiations. And so this went on for about 5 minutes, 5 or 10 minutes. And then we got the recording out. We went round, sat in the next room, put it on the TV and the video recorder, press play. And almost immediately I started to just watch my father putting faces and sticking his tongue out at me and putting his fingers in his ears and stuff. Because what I was doing is, although I was negotiating, I just had my head down. All I was doing is looking at my notes. So my very first lesson was that when you are negotiating, you've also got to be observing and watching the other person. Because if you're not observing them, you have no idea what they're doing either. So very early on, some very, very simple lessons that stuck with me. But the sad thing, and maybe coming back to why I'm doing what I'm doing, the sad thing is that was in the early 1980s. And I went on a negotiation course, I think probably in 2014, 2015. And guess what? It was exactly the same setup. You had a video recording 2 people or 4 people if it's a team across the table. And that was the way that you observed the negotiation. And the problem is, we're having a conversation here over Zoom. You can see me, I can see every nod, every wink, everything else that's going on here. But when you're recording a negotiation and the participants are facing each other, but you're side on, you don't get to see that. So just one of the things that I learned very early on, and when I started to do my own negotiation training, was to try and get cameras in front of people to capture the mannerisms, to be able to observe exactly what goes on and pick up the words. Spent a lot of time on cameras. And the pandemic came along. And then suddenly everybody's got a camera in front of them because they're all doing it on Zoom and Teams and Google Meets and everything else. And it was like, whoa, this is great. So probably about 95% of my courses are now online. And all my negotiation clubs are online over Zoom. And the reason for that is you can learn so much from observing. If I have a club meeting, I've got 10 people in that club meeting, we have 2 people negotiating. I got 8 people who are sat as if they're in front of the other person. And they know, because we've got the negotiation cards, they know what both parties got. They can see every wince, every mannerisms, every silence. And it's a game changer.
Fascinating, isn't it? Because we think of the human interaction and being face to face, as in person, adding so much to something. But actually, from a training perspective, I can really grasp what you're getting at here, because as well, there's something about Zoom, I think, in the Zoom screens that levels us all. So we all look the same size. So you can't intimidate me if you're 6'5", because I won't be able to tell that on a Zoom screen. Whereas if I walk into a room and you're 6'5", that might immediately knock some of my confidence if I haven't practiced enough. So tell us about the negotiation club, Phil, and what that is.
Right. This all came about from basically little experiences I've had all the way through my life. Okay. Starting with the 1980s, the video and the recording. Okay. Just having a little practice negotiation, hugely important. And in my role in procurement, negotiation is very important anyway. So I've been on quite a number of courses. But I always remember a supplier coming in to give me a presentation. And they gave this presentation, and I swear it was terrible. It was horrendous. And I was literally cringing in my seat thinking, you know what, you're pitching to me, and this is horrendous. I mean, really, really bad. But I also realized at a moment, I'm not going to tell them. And at the same time, I realized that if I'm presenting to people, nobody's going to tell me. Nobody's going to give me any real feedback as such. So where do I get feedback? How do I improve my presentation skills? So I started to look. I didn't want to go on a course because I'd been on a course years ago with the old acetate flip charts, which is going back a few years. But I ended up going to a public speaking club. And there's Toastmasters, and here we have the ASC as well, the Association of Speakers Clubs. And I went to a couple of them in the region, and then I ended up settling on the ASC. And literally every fortnight on a Wednesday after work, I go along, and we would just stand up and practice speeches, 4 or 5 minutes. And we just focus on one thing, whether it was the structure, the words, or whatever. So I'd go and practice. I was there for 4 years. Right? It was fantastic. It built my confidence up. I knew what I was doing. And people talk about death by PowerPoint. I spent 4 years, never used a PowerPoint once. Okay. And as I got to the end of it, I was thinking, why are we not doing the same with negotiation skills? Why can't we do that? Why can't we practice like that? Now, coupled to that was the fact that I'd been on a couple of negotiation courses, and just like you said, it was brilliant. Really, really enjoyed it. But 2 or 3 weeks later, I'd forgotten everything that was on the course. I've got the file, I got the book, it was behind me, whatever. But without getting that book out, without using it and practicing it, that knowledge was just filtering away. It was just dissolving away. And you can spend thousands of pounds on a course, but if within a month's time or 2 months' time you can't remember it, you might as well burn the money. It's no good. So I thought, well, how do I combine that public speaking structure of lots of little repeated focus negotiations with negotiations, so speeches with negotiations? And about 5 years ago, I decided to do something about it. But the first problem I had was the only way people are currently being taught negotiation skills, and the only times they got to do a negotiation was often when they get given a case study. And it's like, here's a sheet of A4 or 2 or 3, here's all the data, here's the background information you both know, here's your private information. And you needed like an hour just to work out what type of negotiation you're in. And you'd often be negotiating something where you're in a position you'd never been in before. So I was not going to be writing out thousands of case studies, and that didn't work. But I thought, how do I get people just to jump into negotiation? And I kind of distilled it in my mind. I had a little black book and I kept writing ideas in it. And then I thought, top trumps, cards. I said, why don't I just have a couple of things on there? So I literally, in a book, drew out pictures, put these variables in it, and I created the negotiation cards. First one I had like 6 different variables on it. I had a whole deck, buyers and suppliers. Tried it out. People loved it, but there were some things that were a challenge on it. And I've now developed it all the way through. So now I have like 8 different types of negotiation cards. But you know the one that is the most effective negotiation cards? It's the card that has just one variable on it. It just has one thing on it. If you're a buyer, it has a budget. And if you're a seller, it has a break-even point. And those cards, unreal. Because I can literally shuffle the cards. I can show you a card and I can have a card. And we say, right, you're buying, I'm selling. We need to agree a price per ton of apples. I always pick apples. We can negotiate. Right? You don't need anything else more than that. You need to know you need to negotiate your budget. I need to know I negotiate above a break even. Now we've got everything we do, everything there to be able to try different things out. So I might want to try a different tactic. I might try silence. I might try an odd number. I might try an open question. And you know what? Do that in 4 minutes, have a little bit of reflection, feedback, shuffle the cards, have another go. And suddenly, I've now created this opportunity, just like at the Speakers Club, to get 2 people to have a negotiation. And what's even more important is now the audience can participate because they can watch. If you watch poker, late night poker, all right, go back to the 80s. That was a dingy back of the pub sort of thing, people in a, dark house. Nobody knew what was going on. Somebody put a camera under the table so that you could start watching and see what the cards were. Now you've got a multi-billion-pound industry because somebody put a camera underneath it. And this is exactly the same. I've now created negotiation cards where literally you can watch 2 people negotiate. You know exactly what they've got, and you can see what they're doing. Game changer. Sorry, Susan, I've rambled on there, but
No, you haven't, because I'm going through in my mind what that looks like. So I think anyone listening would be doing the same, and that's really helpful. And of course, as I said to you, I had looked on YouTube, and actually you were negotiating with apples on the one I looked at as well. So someone can have a look at this. But there was something I wanted to pick up in particular there. I mean, you mentioned a couple of different things like silence and so on. But the open question, Philip.
Yeah.
What is the benefit of an open question in a negotiation? Or is there one?
Well, absolutely. Listen, information is power. Okay. In a negotiation, the more information you have, the more proposals you can make, the more creative you can be. And again, coming back to planning and preparation, you can do your research and go into a negotiation. So you've got some information, but all that information is really, generally speaking, assumptions. So once you're in a negotiation, use open questions to elicit information or validate information. Check your assumptions. And then as you're doing that, you're now building up the information in that negotiation for the next step. Now, open questions, simple enough. It's questions where you're eliciting lots of information, how, when, tell me more, as opposed to closed questions, which are often yes, no answers or single word responses. So open questions, hugely important at the beginning of the negotiation, okay? But I would also say there are levels of understanding on how to use an open question, because everybody knows an open question, but where and how you use it. So you can think of a introduction, open question. Just ask an open question. Susan, tell me about your day. Bang, brilliant. Open question. Now I've asked it. Now I can get some information from you, okay? Now there's another level, which is when do you ask the question? Because in negotiations, people often get focused on what's important to them. And a lot of the times they can't help themselves but try and validate what's important very, very early on. So sometimes the very early questions also to the other party is giving you an indicator as to what's important to them. And of course, if you're asking about something, you're telling the other person that's important to them as well. Tell me about your delivery terms. Oh, okay. Well, in that case, delivery might be one of these things they're interested in. So I need to bank that, think about that, because I need to find out some more information because they just told me they're interested in it. So asking a question tells the other person what you're interested in as well. The timing of the question can tell the other person how important it is for you as well. Now, there's another level, which is what do you do with that information? Okay. So it's all very good asking for some information, but you need to be clear about why and what you're going to do with it, and also listening to it as well. So there's another level that's on top of that. But you can ask the questions early on in negotiations, which can validate certain assumptions, but then you need to use the information for that to then consider how to use it later in the negotiations. And it's amazing how much information people miss. So you need to be able to take it down. You need to get your memory skills really, really good with this as well. Now, there's another level on top of that. So, for example, in a negotiation, there are right places and wrong places for every skill and every tactic. And in fact, there are some places in a negotiation I advise you should not ask a question. For example, if I make a proposal and I say, hey, Susan, I'm selling my apples and the price is £800 a ton. And you go, oh, £800? I can't agree to that. Okay. Because you can't agree to it. So it's very easy. You come back to it. But if I said, hey, Susan, I'm selling my apples, they're £800 a ton. And you say, does that include delivery? Now, you've just asked a question. So the first thing you haven't done is to reject the position. And in fact, it's a clarification question. Now, if you can't accept something, okay, it's very easy to say no. But when you can accept something, it can actually be quite difficult in a negotiation to say no. It's difficult to say no when you can say yes. So what people often do is they find other things and other tracks to go down. So they're not saying no, but they'll ask a question. Now, to the trained negotiator, they're listening out for the way that people respond. And I always say to people, if you hear a clarification question to a proposal, that could be a very strong indicator that they can actually accept that proposal. And what they're doing is they're asking for information. And guess what? They're more than likely going to use that information to try and beat down the price. So again, questions, massively important, but there's a lot of subtleties with questions in a negotiation. Even though it sounds like the most simplest thing in the world, there's a lot of things going on there.
It really is. And I think it's such a metaphor for most things is we never really know what the other person is thinking. So even as we're sitting here, Phil, you might think you know what I'm going to ask you next, or I might think I know what you're going to answer. We really don't. And unless we're paying attention, everything goes out the window. And like anything, we get better the more we do it. Doesn't mean it gets easier to negotiate. I think it's the confidence that you alluded to early on. So what I was thinking about was, you do the negotiation club, people sign up from all around the world to come along and watch you run through a negotiation and so on. What surprises people most, perhaps, when they join the club for the first time?
Right. So I would probably say negotiations they're uncomfortable. People find them uncomfortable. It's like public speaking. Right? One of the reasons for that is that, going back to what I said before, we're social animals. We like to do business with people we like. And because we're social animals, we don't like to reject or say no or lie. Okay. And negotiation requires all of that. And people say, oh, you shouldn't lie in a negotiation. Well, if I've got a budget of 600 and somebody says, can you afford 500? And I say no, I'm lying. But actually, it's part of my negotiation. I don't want to agree straight away. There might be something that I need to get. So I need to be able to respond. So that all these elements have it, which means that it's quite uncomfortable for many people in a negotiation. Now, what happens is, in a lot of training, like I said, you have these case studies. So you're not only trying to negotiate based on a case study, but you're trying to negotiate where it's not you as a person. You're pretending to be something else. Now, what I've done is, when I've used these cards, first of all, the cards are super, super simple. I've had 12-year-old kids using the cards. I've had 93-year-old gentlemen using the cards as well. It literally anybody can use them. Okay. So there's no barriers to practicing your negotiation skills. Anybody can do it. The other thing is that I get people to negotiate with the price per ton of apples. Generally speaking, there's not a large population out there that negotiate in large volumes of fruit. So everybody knows that they're all in the same basket. Okay. So nobody's got any advantage. And that's really important in negotiation training. When I'm training procurement people, and I've had a lot of companies say to me, oh, could you do it on containers, shipping containers? Because that's what no, I don't want to do that. Because what you have is, you have individuals who are more worried about the way that they're being seen and about the knowledge they know than the skills of negotiation. No, they're going to do apples like everybody else. And then, because it's just 4 minutes and I do it in the format I have, what we end up is a situation where anybody can do it. It's really, really simple. It's a game to start with. It's a really simple game. But then after they've been practicing for a period of time, particularly in the club, it stops becoming a game and becomes an opportunity to try something. So I'm going to try silence. I might try a threat. I'm going to try a range tactic. So now it becomes something where we can try it. And what happens is, you go from an uncomfortable sort of process, an uncomfortable negotiation, to actually something that people enjoy. And I think the one thing that most people are surprised at by the time they've done my course and by the time they're on the course is that they are really enjoying the negotiations. And that's a far cry from what most people have. I'll go back to the point where we said about confidence. Okay. I finished a course yesterday, 4 weeks with a company, really large company. They had an apprentice on there. Apprentice has only been there like 6 months, but they had procurement people who had been in there for years. And this young lady even told the manager, I'm really anxious. I'm really worried about this. I don't want to be seen up and everything else. Anyway, at the end of the 4 weeks, I asked everybody, and she said, I cannot get over how much more confident I am. I've got a negotiation module coming up soon. I'm really looking forward to that. And for me, that's again, come back to that word, the game changer. That's a game changer. People who start off nervous, anxious, uncomfortable, and at the end of it, they can't wait to have a go. They want another card. Susan, that's for me is where there's another sort of halo to this. It's not just the skills, it's the individuals.
Absolutely. And that word enjoyment is so key, isn't it? I think, because once we enjoy something, we're vested in it in a different way. And even if it becomes uncomfortable for a little while, we've got enough muscle memory now to know that actually we're capable and remember that we're confident in doing it. These people skills that we've been talking about here, Phil, and the human skills, again, I go back to the point, I think we underestimate how much we need to practice them in order to really go through our work lives in a easier way, in a more fulfilling, simplified way, because actually there's a lot we can do with simple practice. And I think most of us want to go straight into the negotiation, get it over and done with, and get out the door. And we don't think about how much better we could negotiate if we had the skills to do it.
Yeah, but I'd also say that we already have the skills, but it's like an unconscious incompetence type thing. Okay, we don't have to ask a question. It's the purposeful aspect of it. It's doing it on purpose and knowing you can do it on purpose. That's what's really important when it comes to negotiations. I mean, you've literally just said that people want to get in and get out. Yeah, I go back to it. Preparation and planning is almost out the window. They want to get in and get out. That's fine. I talk about the learning curve, and people are familiar with the learning journey, the unconscious incompetence, all that kind of stuff. But the reality is that if you read a book or go on a video, you get made aware of something. So you're made aware of the odd number. All right, you're made aware of odd numbers. Okay, brilliant. You've now got the theory. You've now gone from unconscious incompetence, because you didn't know about it, to conscious incompetence. Because although you know it, you now need to try it. Now, as much as the odd number is great, there are some places where you shouldn't use it. All right. It's not like, oh, use it every single time. If you're going into a negotiation and nobody's put anything on the table and you're not quite sure, all right, I often suggest using a round number. And the reason for using the round number or round position at the very beginning is because the other party is going to react much quicker to a round number. And they'll be able to know immediately whether that round number is acceptable or not. Is £1,000 acceptable or not? They will respond very, very quickly. And like I said, there's a different response between people who can accept it but want more and those who cannot accept it and therefore can reject it nice and easily. So use a round number then. Once you've gauged whether it's I want some more or I cannot do it, now you can start to think about, well, where do I introduce the odd numbers? Because then the odd number becomes far more powerful. But if I go in and I say, yeah, it's £1,462.50, to be honest, the person on the other side is just trying, what the hell is going on here? They're not going to react to whether they can accept it or not, because a lot of other things are going through their minds. So the knowledge in itself is only the first step. You now need to try it, because when you try it, you start to appreciate where it works, where it doesn't work, how it works. You get all the nuances to it. And the thing about negotiations is there are literally hundreds of little tactics and little strategies you can take. So you can practice for years and you'll still be practicing new ones. I'll tell you another simple negotiation skill, stroke tactic, which is brilliant. It's just to summarize. Literally to summarize. And the reason why I say that is people often have a negotiation or they'll have a meeting and they'll summarize at the end. And when you summarize at the end, that's when people find that there's been mistakes made or somebody's misheard something. Summarize all the way through. So when you make a proposal, there's ways to summarize as well. But when there's an exchange or you ask an open question, summarize it. Because when you summarize, Susan, if you say something to me and I say, oh, so Susan, let me just summarize what I just think you've just said there. Not only am I checking that we've got common understanding, but guess what? I'm telling you that I'm listening to you. And when people know they're being listened to, they're more inclined to share more information. You're building up empathy. So summarizing does more than just check the information. It's relationship building. And if I'm honest, I now use this all the time when the wife is speaking to me, because I like to just double check that I've heard her right before I then go off and do what I should be doing. So it's a tactic that you don't even have to just practice for your negotiations. You can use this in life. So again, a lot of these things we know, but we don't think about. But once we start to become aware of them, it can really make a difference. I often say, label it. Tell them that you're summarizing. Don't just repeat verbatim what they've said. All right. And that's, again, it's a subtle but important step in summarizing. Let me just recap what you just said. Let me just summarize what I think I've just heard. It gets the other party prepared to listen, because now you've just set them up for, right, I'm going to listen and check, and you're looking for a yes or a no, or maybe you get some more additional information. So yeah, like I said, with the questions, the open questions, there's level upon levels upon levels. You've got to practice, and you start with the simple stuff. Once you start to really understand it, that's when you can get clever. And if you do that and the other party is negotiating, they don't do that, you're already in a much more strengthened position than the other party. And it's just a simple thing. It's not a difficult thing, it's a simple things.
Absolutely. And the basics, it's always about knowing the basics well. And when you have a good foundation in most things in life, you build off that, because the foundation brings you your confidence, I think, in the first place.
Too many people think that they can pass their driving license and they can get into a Formula One car. And it's the same with negotiations. They go on a very expensive negotiation course, spend 3 days in a hotel, and now they think they can go in and negotiate a multi-billion-pound deal.
Or Brexit.
Or Brexit, yeah. Brexit was an interesting one, although we might want to get. I downloaded the Brexit deal and I read through it, because the other issue with negotiations is there's a lot of pundits who can obviously talk about the negotiations, but unless you're in that negotiation, you haven't got a leg to stand on. You just don't. I do an exercise in my 4th session, and it's to do with multi-variables. We have a card with 6 different variables on it, okay? And I do an exercise in there, and it's an exercise which will just unlock your understanding of the negotiation process. Nobody does it. Nobody. Businesses don't do it. Individual. I do it. I literally, if I have a negotiation with somebody, I am literally doing this exercise, and it makes a huge difference. So there's a lot that can be done. Yeah.
Fantastic. I love what you say about purposeful. The whole way through, you brought me back to that. And I think that's a great thing to take away from this episode as well, Phil. We talked a lot about the negotiation clubs and negotiations in different ways. Tell me, how does somebody sign up to do some work with you? Or if they're curious about knowing more about the negotiation club, how can they do that?
So the website, if you go to the negotiationclubs.com, okay, so at the website, there's several things. First of all, I'm starting to develop it. There's 3 pillars to the negotiation club. The first one is the negotiation cards, which are the resources that allow you to practice. Because one of the things about going on a training course is that once you finish the training course, what do you do next? Well, the negotiation cards is perfect. You can just get the cards and practice yourselves. Although I would advise, if you've got children, do not let them play with the cards, okay? Because you do not need to teach them any more negotiation skills. I've already had some complaints about that, okay? Particularly from mothers. If you do that, I'll do this. So negotiation cards. So you can go on the website, you can order those, you can buy those, okay? The next one is, you kind of need to know how to practice. So I run a taster. Every month I run an open free taster, normally on the 4th Thursday of every month. And again, you can sign up, come along, get to experience it, meet other people. We had a taster last night. We had somebody from Portugal, from Italy, from Bulgaria, from the US, from Wales, from England, and somewhere else. Can't remember. We have people from all over the world who just come along to the taster, and they just get an experience of how to practice, which you don't get anywhere else. You just don't get that anywhere else. And then the third, there are obviously courses you can go on as well. And I do courses from universities to colleges to corporates and management teams. And guess what? It's all apples. They're still doing apples, okay? It's always apples. All right? And of course, I do courses in person as well. I've got a summer camp coming up in a couple of weeks at Nottingham Trent University. Last year, we had 80 students in a room, and every single one of them was negotiating using the cards. All right? So nobody stood there doing nothing. They're all involved in it. And of course, the third bit is the fact that it's great that you know about this. Now you need somewhere to practice, and that's where I run the clubs. And I run them online. I have a student club that runs in the month. I have professionals that run in the month. I have companies who want their own teams to practice. So I will facilitate their club. So, once a month, get together. And that's a great place for even the business people to say, right, I've got this coming up. What should we practice? And for others just to learn from the other parts of the business as well. So for anybody who wants to consider this, because it's not for everybody, but if anybody wants to improve their negotiation skills, get yourself on a taster, get yourself a deck of cards, and if you really like it, come along and join a club. We are normal people. It is just like, we are normal. It is just like this public speaking club. When I went to the public speaking club, there was no professionals. It was people who were retired. It was students. It was people who just wanted to build their confidence up. That's a negotiation club. Oh, and that's something else, Susan, I'll just say there as well. One of the inspirations behind the negotiation club is that if you are in a business, generally speaking, you will never get a chance to have a negotiation course. It is normally for people who are either in procurement, in sales, and potentially maybe another department or two. But I went to a supplier a number of years ago, and I remember sitting in the reception area, and the receptionist sat me down, got me coffee, and then I overheard a conversation she had on the phone. She was negotiating with a travel agency for the business. And I thought, you know what? She's never going to go on a negotiation course. Nobody's ever going to give her feedback. She's never going to get an opportunity to see that. And I thought, what I wanted to do is create a club like the Speakers Club where anybody could come along, no matter what your skill level is or where you're from. And that's what I'm doing now. It's all about building a community of people who can practice. So people who are interested in that, come along and do it. Have a go.
Fantastic. Love it. I did Toastmasters, so I completely understand. There's a supportive environment where everyone's just trying to help you do better. That's really what it comes down to. And everyone starts off in the same boat, and it's a great leveler as well. Phil, thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been a real fun conversation.
Listen, I've really, really enjoyed it as well. We never quite know where we'll go with some of these discussions, and I feel as if we could keep on talking for a lot longer as well. But no, Susan, really, really enjoyed it. I hope the audience also gets something from it as well. And I would suggest say, Susan, keep up the good work. I love the fact that you've really got this broad reach and you're trying lots of different things. I love it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the paths we traversed on today's episode. If something rang through for you, be sure to let me know. Or maybe you can share this with someone in your life who would benefit from listening too. And if you enjoy helping others, I'd be so grateful if you would leave a review, so that people who might also be curious about their own life beyond the numbers can discover this podcast too.